As the 14th century began, the lands between the Oxus and Jaxartes became a battlefield. Where Mongol dominion had once stretched across continents, its empire now lay fragmented. The Chagatai Khanate, once a linchpin of Genghis Khan's empire, had collapsed into a patchwork of quarreling petty states. Every valley boasted its own claimant to sovereignty. Every city paid homage to a self-styled sultan. Ancient trade routes ran red with blood, and the glories of Transoxiana faded under the shadow of ambition and decline. From this collapse emerged new syntheses. Turkic horsemen who had conquered the region generations earlier had adopted the refined culture of their Persian subjects. They learned to appreciate gardens, poetry, and prophetic lore, even while maintaining their skill with horse and bow. In the towns, the Sharia governed daily life. In the countryside, Sufi mystics offered solace to those weary of war. Tribes still roamed the steppes, yet they too had been touched by Persian revival. Warriors praised beauty in verse, merchants prayed between deals, and mystics bridged faith and folklore. In this fractured and evolving landscape, a child was born in the town of Kesh, south of Samarkand. Later known as Shahrisabz, the Green Settlement, Kesh was home to a noble but diminished clan, claiming descent from Karachar Noyan, a commander of Genghis Khan. This lineage earned them the title of Tarkhan, granted special rights by the Khans themselves, but their power had long since withered. The boy was named Timur, iron in the Turkic tongue. His father, Taragai, was a man of gentle character, more interested in scholarship than politics. This peaceful disposition, however admirable, left the family vulnerable. From early childhood, Timur saw how nobility without strength invited contempt. He learned that goodness, unguarded by force, became a weakness to be exploited. These bitter truths would shape him. During Timur's youth, the most powerful figure in Transoxiana was Emir Kazagan, a warlord who had united tribes through brutality and reward. Recognizing futility and resistance, Taragai sent Timur to serve under Kazagan. There, Timur absorbed the art of statecraft, not from books, but from ruthless pragmatism. He learned how power was maintained through fear, how loyalty was bought with plunder, and how figurehead Genghisid princes lent legitimacy to those who held real authority. Timur also grasped a deeper political truth. The steppe's traditional law, the Yasa, still held sway among nomads, while Sharia ruled the cities. A wise leader honored both systems without allowing either to undermine the other. Under Kazagan, Timur also studied warfare deeply, combining steppe tactics with gunpowder innovations, engineering, and logistics. He learned siegecraft, strategy, and the mathematics of battle. He memorized the contours of Central Asian politics, like a scholar memorizing scripture. His courage in battle earned renown, even after a leg injury left him with a permanent limp. The cause of the wound remains debated. Some say it came from battle, others from bandits, but it left him with the moniker Timur the Lame, Tamerlane. Rather than diminish his power, this wound became a mark of valor and sacrifice, earning the respect of his followers. Beyond war, Timur learned governance. He studied men, watched how loyalty shifted, and how marriages or oaths could forge alliances. He saw how Kazagan resettled artisans and protected trade routes, understanding that prosperity was vital for stability. Every tactic, brutal or elegant, was stored in his keen memory. Beneath apparent loyalty, Timur harbored deeper ambitions. These ambitions took spiritual form when Timur encountered the Sufi mystic Mir Sayyid Baraka. A fusion of Islamic orthodoxy and ancient wisdom, Baraka's teachings turned Timur's thirst for power into a mission. He came to believe his conquests were divinely ordained, acts of justice and restoration rather than mere war. This belief became central to Timur's ideology. He would rule not only as a conqueror, but as the instrument of divine will. Baraka also taught practical lessons. Drawing on decades of observation, he showed Timur how rulers could govern vast, diverse lands by embodying both warrior strength and religious righteousness. Timur learned to tailor his message to different audiences. To nomads, he was Genghis Khan's heir. To devout townsfolk, the sword of Allah. To merchants, a protector of peace and profit. This multifaceted identity confused some, but it reflected Central Asia's hybrid soul. Pure nomadism had faded, but sedentary life alone could not command loyalty. Success would belong to those who could unite the steppe's martial spirit with Persia's administrative sophistication. The opportunity to act came swiftly. In 1361, Kazaghan was assassinated, and his fragile coalition collapsed. Timur allied with Amir Hussein, Kazaghan's grandson. Together, they reconquered much of Transoxiana, combining steppe mobility with advanced siege tactics. They fought together for nearly a decade, but tensions simmered. Though Hussein had the bloodline, Timur had the charisma and loyalty of the troops. Their partnership unraveled during the siege of Balkh in 1369. Though both men had mastered siegecraft, Timur's use of psychological warfare, massacres, and intimidation broke enemy morale with chilling efficiency. After the city fell, it was clear Timur no longer intended to remain second in command. Rather than challenge Hussein openly, Timur staged a slow coup. He praised Hussein while quietly undermining him, presenting himself as loyal yet unappreciated. When Hussein began purging rivals, even his allies turned against him. Timur then moved swiftly, using tribal councils and religious leaders to legitimize his ascent. In 1370, Timur was declared Lord of Transoxiana. He ruled from Samarkand, a city at the crossroads of Asia. From there, Timur began transforming his realm into a base for greater ambitions. He understood the failures of past conquerors. Nomads expanded but lacked institutions. Cities endured but stagnated. Timur would synthesize both. His army remained organized by the ancient decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. But now integrated engineers, gunpowder experts, and siege specialists. Timur also prioritized economic extraction and statecraft. Skilled artisans and scholars were relocated to his core territories. Trade was protected, agriculture taxed efficiently, and crafts supported. Such efforts demanded accurate records, long-distance communication, and ideological justification. Timur's solution lay in balancing the Yasa and Sharia. Among tribes, he upheld steppe codes and lineage. In cities, he enforced Islamic law. To nomads, he was a steppe warrior. To townspeople, the sword of the faith. To merchants, a guarantor of safety and prosperity. It was not contradiction, but synthesis. Timur's genius lay in recognizing that domination required both force and vision, fear and legitimacy. Through calculated violence, spiritual charisma, and administrative innovation, he created a model of empire neither purely Mongol nor entirely Persian, but something new. By 1370, the stage was set. With a foundation of loyal fighters, thriving cities, and ideological clarity, Timur looked outward. The fractured kingdoms of the Islamic world, the crumbling legacy of the Mongols, and the rising powers to the west and east all beckoned. A world broken by ambition awaited a conqueror capable of uniting faith, fire, and steel. The army stood at the edge of the river as mist rose, ready to leave behind the secured lands of Transoxiana. What lay ahead, Persia, was broken and open to conquest, calling to their hunger and their mission. Chroniclers called it the Great Persecution, but to the Iron Lord, it was justice for a world weakened by failed rulers. Presenting itself as a patchwork of competing dynasties, the fragmented realm that had once bowed to the Ilkhans now claimed legitimacy while possessing neither the strength to defend their pretensions nor the wisdom to recognize their inadequacy. Falling first to engines that combined Chinese innovation with steppe persistence, Khwarezm saw its ancient walls crumble before coordinated assault. Weakened by decades of internal strife, the defenders offered defiance that proved more symbolic than effective. Their sultan, a man whose genealogy traced back to the heroes of the Crusades, but whose courage had been diluted by generations of palace intrigue, yielded his capital after a blockade that lasted barely 3 months. Demonstrating principles that would govern all subsequent efforts toward the Sunset Lands, the reduction of Khwarezm showed how dread served as the advance guard of his forces, traveling faster than his swiftest horsemen to prepare the ground for domination. Settlements that yielded without opposition found themselves treated with relative mercy, their populations preserved, and their trade restored under new management. Those that chose defiance discovered that their fate would serve as lessons for any who might harbor similar thoughts of heroic futility. Reflecting his understanding that sustainable control required more than battlefield victories, the systematic nature of this approach emphasized how each fallen realm needed to contribute to the strength of the whole, providing resources for future operations while serving as secure bases for extended forays far from home. These acquisitions meant preserving productive capacity wherever possible, while ensuring that rebellion would be both difficult to organize and catastrophically expensive to attempt. Expanding into a comprehensive system for redistributing human talent across his growing domains, the deportation policies that he had first tested in Transoxiana now reached new levels of sophistication. Master craftsmen found themselves relocated to enrich his capital, while learned men and administrators were dispersed to strengthen the governance of newly acquired lands. Serving multiple purposes, the practice weakened conquered areas by removing their most capable inhabitants while strengthening his own holdings with an influx of skills and knowledge. From Khwarezm, attention turned toward the ancient province that served as Central Asia's crossroads, where Persian culture had first flowered under the patronage of enlightened monarchs. Current overlords of this region, descendants of the Khatid dynasty, had managed to maintain their independence through a combination of diplomatic skill and strategic insignificance. Neither completely Persian nor entirely Turkic, neither firmly sedentary nor truly tribal, they had survived by being useful to everyone while threatening no one. Collapsing the moment scouts appeared on their frontiers, this approach of careful neutrality left the prince of the great market town recognizing that his modest troops could never hope to match the approaching storm. Attempting to negotiate a tributary arrangement that would preserve his throne while acknowledging superior power, his envoys carried rich gifts and elaborate assurances of devotion, hoping to satisfy the world shaker's appetite without provoking his wrath. But having learned from his years of service under others that mercy shown to one could be interpreted as weakness by many, the master of Samarkand understood different calculations, echoing far beyond its borders and demonstrating to potential resistors throughout Persia that neither compliance nor defiance offered any guarantee of survival. The fate of this crossroads province would send a message. Only absolute surrender, followed by perfect obedience, could earn the privilege of continued existence under his dominion. Unfolding with mathematical precision, each phase calculated to maximize both physical devastation and mental impact. the investment of the great trading center became a masterpiece of applied intimidation. Built by generations of Persian architects and strengthened by centuries of accumulated wealth, the settlement's magnificent walls provided an ideal stage for demonstrating the futility of passive defense against active aggression. Day by day, his engines reduced proud towers to rubble, while his miners undermined foundations that had seemed permanent as mountains. Yet laying not in these borrowed technologies, but in the systematic application of dread as a force multiplier that could accomplish more than any number of catapults or battering rams, the true innovation reflected deeper understanding. Carefully cultivated and strategically deployed, a reputation for implacable cruelty could open gates that might otherwise require months of investment to breach, ensuring that stories of his ruthlessness reached potential enemies before his troops did, preparing them to consider surrender long before his banners appeared on their horizons. The key lay in mental preparation, providing the perfect opportunity to refine these techniques into an art form that would serve him throughout his ventures toward the Sunset Lands. The fall of the trading center demonstrated comprehensive application of intimidation. When the defenders finally yielded after a blockade that lasted 6 months, they discovered that their suffering had only begun. Facing systematic sorting designed to extract maximum value from the victory, while ensuring that the lesson would be remembered by anyone who heard the tale, the inhabitants experienced carefully orchestrated brutality, finding themselves bound for distant Samarkand, where their expertise would enrich his capital. Skilled artisans faced relocation that served strategic purposes. Learned men faced interrogation designed to determine their usefulness as administrators, or their danger as potential sources of rebellion. Given the choice between service in his host or death, common soldiers discovered the stark mathematics of survival, while merchants learned that their accumulated wealth now belonged to new owners who had earned it through superior application of organized violence. Serving purposes that extended far beyond mere revenge or the satisfaction of bloodlust, the slaughter that followed was calculated for maximum effect. Each death was designed to produce maximum intimidation among those who survived to spread the tale. Rising in the settlement's principal squares, towers of skulls demonstrated through their precise geometry that even mass killing could be organized according to aesthetic principles that reflected the mind behind the carnage. More importantly, following patterns designed to eliminate potential leadership while preserving productive capacity, the selection of victims showed strategic thinking. Facing universal execution, members of the old ruling class saw their bloodlines ended to prevent future claims to power. Meeting similar fates, clerical figures who had supported opposition served as warnings to their counterparts in unconquered lands. Yet finding themselves spared, farmers, craftsmen, and merchants who had played no role in the defiance discovered their survival conditional upon their future utility to their new overlords. Governing his approach to domination throughout his career, these principles first tested in the Crossroads province would prove enduring. Serving strategic purposes that went far beyond personal satisfaction or cultural expression, the systematic nature of his cruelty sent specific messages to specific audiences, designed to create networks of dread that could accomplish more than battalions of horsemen. Each episode of brutality carried carefully calculated meaning. From the smoking ruins of the trading center, his gaze turned northward toward the lands that had once acknowledged the power of the great Western Khanate, facing internal divisions that mirrored the fragmentation plaguing every corner of the former Mongol realm. The mighty confederation that had dominated the northern steppes for over 2 centuries now struggled with decline. Standing at its head, the ambitious Khan represented a prince whose goals matched his abilities, but whose resources had been depleted by years of civil conflict, carrying implications that reached far beyond personal animosity or territorial disputes. The rivalry between these two descendants of Genghis Khan's legacy touched fundamental questions of identity and purpose. Both men claimed to represent the restoration of proper tribal values in a world grown soft through excessive accommodation with sedentary customs. Both presented themselves as champions of orthodox faith against enemies who had corrupted the pure practice of worship. Yet differing in ways that made peaceful coexistence impossible, their visions of what such restoration should accomplish created inevitable conflict. Seeing himself as the rightful heir to the great Khan's northern dominions, destined to reunite the fragmented lands that stretched from the Volga to the Danube under a single banner, the Western Khan had already reclaimed much of his confederation's heartland, working to forge alliances with distant powers who shared his interest in containing the expanding influence from the east. His diplomats sought to build coalitions. From his perspective, the upstart from Transoxiana represented an illegitimate usurper whose success threatened the natural order that placed true Genghisids above pretenders and parvenus. Conversely, having long since transcended such narrow definitions of legitimacy, the Iron Lord drew his standing not from bloodlines traced through dubious genealogies, but from demonstrated ability to impose his will upon a recalcitrant world, proving his worthiness through victory rather than inheritance, earning divine favor through successful application of righteous force, rather than claiming it through accidents of birth. He embodied a different principle. In his view, the Northern Khan represented exactly the sort of fossilized thinking that had reduced the great inheritance to a collection of squabbling principalities. Near the Terek River, two visions collided in a fight that would define what came next. Having spent months preparing for this confrontation, gathering intelligence about his opponent's methods while positioning his own units to maximize their advantages, the World Shaker approached this challenge systematically, laying in their superior numbers and intimate knowledge of the local terrain. The Western Confederation's strength contrasted with his forces' better discipline and more advanced technologies, showcasing tactical innovations that had been perfected during years of fighting in Persia. The engagement itself demonstrated strategic brilliance. Rather than seeking immediate decisive battle, he employed an approach of feigned retreat that drew the Khan's warriors away from their prepared positions into terrain of his choosing. Confident in their numerical superiority and eager to close with enemies who seemed to be fleeing, the northern fighters pursued the apparently defeated invaders across broken ground that negated their advantages in mounted warfare, closing with mechanical precision when the supposedly retreating columns suddenly wheeled and formed fighting formations that caught the pursuing horsemen in a deadly embrace. The trap demonstrated superior planning, finding his host surrounded by enemies who seemed to have materialized from the earth itself, their disciplined volleys of arrows cutting down his finest warriors before they could close to effective range. The Western Khan witnessed his advantage evaporate, becoming a slaughter that demonstrated the superiority of organization over enthusiasm, planning over improvisation. The engagement proved decisive on the field. Yet even total victory on the battlefield could not resolve the fundamental problem that the Northern Khan represented. Escaping the carnage with sufficient retainers to maintain his claim to leadership, retreating to fortified positions where he could rebuild his strength while seeking assistance from foreign allies. His survival meant that Timur would need to return to these lands again and again. Each expedition would require greater resources and produce diminishing returns, making a different approach necessary, laying in systematic devastation designed to eliminate not just the Khan's immediate capacity for warfare, but the entire infrastructure that supported his continued resistance. The solution demanded comprehensive action. Launched in 1395 after Christ, the Second Offensive against the Northern Confederation aimed not merely to defeat enemy units, but to render the steppes incapable of supporting organized defiance for generations to come, exceeding anything witnessed during the initial expansion of the world conqueror 2 centuries earlier. The ravaging that followed demonstrated escalated brutality. Settlement after settlement felt the weight of systematic pacification, their inhabitants facing the stark choice between immediate departure or immediate death. Burning for weeks while its treasures enriched his servants and its people, swelled the ranks of skilled deportees heading eastward toward his capital. The Confederation's magnificent center provided the most dramatic example, rippling outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. The mental impact of this devastation affected regions far beyond the immediate theater of operations. Russian princes who had grown comfortable under the Great Khanat's protection suddenly found themselves exposed to direct contact with a lord whose reputation for merciless efficiency preceded his units by months. Seeking assistance that proved either inadequate or non-existent, their desperate embassies to distant courts revealed their isolation, while their own preparations for investment showed the fundamental weakness of defenses designed to deter raiders rather than resist systematic advance. Trembling behind walls that had never been tested by enemies possessing Chinese war engines and the mathematical knowledge to employ them effectively, Moscow itself, that rising center of Russian Orthodox power, faced unprecedented threat, finding himself facing choices that offered no guarantee of survival, regardless of which path he selected. The principality's leader, a careful man who had survived decades of steppe politics through judicious applications of compliance and resistance, confronted an impossible situation. Yet halting as suddenly as it had begun, the advance toward the heart of Russian lands stopped, not through enemy resistance, but through the strategic calculations of a commander who understood the difference between possible victories and profitable ones. Offering little in the way of portable wealth, while their sparse inhabitants could contribute neither significant strength nor valuable specialized skills to his growing realm, the northern forests that sheltered Moscow and its sister settlements presented poor targets for sustained effort. More importantly, straining his lines of communication beyond the breaking point, while providing opportunities for enemies closer to home to challenge his power in more vital areas. Prolonged operations in these distant regions carried excessive risk, written in the graves of every great commander from Alexander to Genghis Khan himself. The lesson of overextension was one that he possessed sufficient wisdom to recognize when strategic withdrawal served his interests better than tactical advance. Serving his purposes perfectly without requiring permanent occupation of lands that offered minimal returns on investment, the devastation of the Northern Confederation's heartland achieved its objectives efficiently. Rendered incapable of supporting organized resistance for the foreseeable future, the steppes had been neutralized, while the dread generated by his operations provided protection for his southern and eastern flanks, more effective than any number of garrison fortresses. With the northern threat neutralized, attention turned toward richer prizes that beckoned from the ancient lands of Mesopotamia. Reduced to a shadow of its former glory by centuries of Turkish domination and earlier devastation, the Abbasid Caliphate still commanded respect as the spiritual center of Sunni orthodoxy, making it a prize worthy of any sovereign's attention. Its strategic position, astride the trade routes connecting Asia with the Mediterranean, combined symbolic importance with practical value. managing to restore a measure of prosperity through careful neutrality and profitable accommodation with whoever possessed sufficient strength to demand their compliance. The great metropolis's current overlords consisted of competing emirs who acknowledged the nominal power of a powerless caliph. Trading impartially with Christian crusader states and rival Muslim dynasties, their merchants had rebuilt commerce, while their learned men preserved the accumulated wisdom of classical antiquity in libraries that attracted students from across the known world, marking it for elimination in the eyes of a commander who saw doctrinal diversity as evidence of moral corruption. This cosmopolitan tolerance that had enabled Baghdad's revival after previous catastrophes now became its doom, leaving no room for the theological sophistication that had once made the metropolis a beacon of learning and enlightenment. His vision of proper practice brooked no compromise. In his view, Baghdad's current inhabitants had betrayed their sacred trust by accommodating error instead of crushing it, by seeking profit rather than purity. In early 1401, the siege of Baghdad began, following tactics the leader had honed in Persia and the steppes, yet requiring innovations in both technology and methods that pushed his military machine to new levels of sophistication. The metropolis's massive walls and numerous defenders presented unprecedented challenges. Working alongside Persian mathematicians to design war engines capable of breaching fortifications that had withstood every assault for over a century, Chinese engineers pushed the boundaries of siegecraft. More importantly, demanding propagandistic preparation that would justify the elimination of the faith's most venerable center to believers throughout his realm. The spiritual significance of the target required careful handling, working to construct theological arguments that presented the action not as an attack upon worship, but as its purification, not as devastation, but as restoration. His learned men crafted sophisticated justifications. Having forfeited their right to guard the sacred places through their tolerance of practices that corrupted the faith's essential purity, the current inhabitants of Baghdad faced divine judgment through earthly instruments, requiring careful balance of competing demands that had destroyed lesser commanders who attempted similar juggling acts. The doctrinal dimension of the venture tested his political skills, needing to see the investment as profitable enough to justify the enormous costs in time and resources that it demanded. His tribal warriors required material motivation, requiring assurance that their own practices would not be subject to similar purification in the future. His Persian subjects needed theological distinction, most delicately needing to understand that his actions served rather than threatened the interests of true faith everywhere. The broader world of believers demanded careful explanation, providing the perfect stage for demonstrating these complex messages through symbolic actions that spoke louder than any proclamation. The fall of Baghdad, when it finally came after 8 months of increasingly desperate resistance, showcased masterful propaganda, serving multiple audiences simultaneously, its carefully orchestrated brutality conveying different meanings to different observers while maintaining perfect internal consistency. The systematic slaughter that followed the metropolis's surrender demonstrated sophisticated messaging, representing the righteous reward of faithful service, the legitimate spoils of victory earned through superior courage and endurance. To his tribal warriors, the carnage provided visible proof of their commander's promises fulfilled, rising in the principal squares, while the systematic looting that accompanied the killing demonstrated that loyalty brought tangible benefits extending far beyond mere spiritual satisfaction. The towers of skulls that marked the triumph served as monuments to success, serving as a cautionary tale about the consequences of doctrinal laxity rather than ethnic persecution. To his Persian subjects, the elimination carried different meaning. earning their fate not through their Arab ancestry, but through their theological corruption, their willingness to compromise pure practice for the sake of commercial convenience and intellectual pride. The victims had brought judgment upon themselves, awaiting any who allowed similar compromises to take root in their own communities. Regardless of their ethnic heritage or allegiance, similar fates served as warnings. Establishing his credentials as the defender of orthodox faith against innovations that threatened the worship's essential character, to the broader world of believers, his actions in Baghdad demonstrated commitment to purity, eliminating learned men whose teachings had deviated from acceptable interpretations, while the burning of suspect texts preserved future generations from exposure to corrupting influences. The slaughter served purification rather than mere destruction. Far from representing an attack upon the faith, the action demonstrated his commitment to purifying it from within, extending beyond immediate propagandistic needs to encompass genuinely held convictions that shaped his understanding of his own role in divine providence. The spiritual justification for his actions reflected deeper understanding. Having convinced him that earthly leaders served as instruments of celestial will, that victory undertaken in the service of righteousness represented a form of worship as pleasing to Allah as formal prayer or charitable giving, his years of study with Sufi masters provided ideological foundation, providing the framework that enabled him to pursue objectives that might otherwise have seemed contradictory or hypocritical. This theological understanding justified apparent paradoxes, serving the cause of unity by removing sources of doctrinal diversity that confused believers and weakened their commitment to orthodox practice. The systematic elimination of competing voices advanced rather than hindered spiritual goals, strengthening the realm of true believers by concentrating talent and knowledge in lands governed according to proper principles. The deportation of skilled craftsmen and learned men served sacred as well as secular purposes. Most importantly, serving sacred purposes by encouraging potential enemies to yield without resistance, thereby minimizing the bloodshed required to achieve righteous objectives. The dread that preceded his units and followed in their wake represented divine mercy, expressed through earthly intimidation, saving more lives than it cost by convincing adversaries that compliance offered their only hope of survival. A reputation for merciless cruelty, carefully cultivated and strategically deployed, could paradoxically serve humanitarian ends. Yet remaining conscious of the need to balance intimidation with mercy in ways that would inspire genuine devotion rather than mere compliance born of fear, even as he refined these techniques into instruments of almost supernatural effectiveness. The world shaker understood the limitations of dread alone, understanding that lasting control required subjects who served from conviction rather than compulsion, who saw their sovereign's power as legitimate rather than merely irresistible. The most successful commanders throughout history had always combined force with persuasion, lying in determining which inhabitants deserved mercy and which required elimination, which settlements could be preserved as examples of enlightened governance, and which needed to be obliterated as warnings to potential resistors. The challenge demanded wisdom as well as strength, requiring intimate knowledge of local conditions combined with strategic vision that could anticipate the long-term consequences of immediate choices. These decisions tested every aspect of command, serving as the perfect culmination of his ventures toward the Sunset Lands, demonstrating to the entire world of believers that no metropolis, however venerable its history or secure its defenses, could resist the advance of righteous force properly supported by divine favor. Baghdad's elimination achieved multiple objectives, reaching from the Atlantic shores of Morocco to the spice markets of the Indian Ocean. The smoking ruins of the Abbasid capital sent a message that resonated across continents. A new power had arisen in the east, one that possessed both the ability and the willingness to reshape the map of the known world according to its own vision of proper order. From the ashes of Baghdad, his gaze turned toward prizes that had beckoned commanders since the dawn of recorded history. Still clinging to its ancient capital at Constantinople, the Byzantine remnant represented one challenge. While the rising Ottoman Beylik had begun to establish itself as a major force in Anatolia and the Balkans, representing another. Both presented tests that would pit his military machine against enemies who combined established strengths with innovative adaptations to changing conditions. Yet laying further still, beyond the narrow straits that separated Asia from Europe, the greatest prize of all beckoned tantalizingly, offering opportunities for advance that carried both material and spiritual rewards. The fractured kingdoms of the former Crusader states presented tempting targets, while the rising powers of Western Europe represented potential allies or enemies, whose support or resistance could determine the ultimate scope of his achievements, set for operations that would determine whether his vision of righteous control could transcend the boundaries that had constrained previous empire builders. Whether a tribal prince from the steppes of Central Asia possessed the resources and wisdom necessary to challenge the established powers of both East and West simultaneously, the stage awaited the next act. Having proven its effectiveness against the fractured realms of Persia and the declining powers of the northern steppes, the scourge now prepared to test itself against enemies whose strength had been tempered by centuries of conflict with the greatest martial traditions of both Asia and Europe. Sacred flames flickered in temple courtyards across the Ganges plain, as word spread of the approaching storm from the northwest passes. The year 1398, after Christ would witness the collision of two worlds, the refined civilization of Hindustan and the disciplined fury of the steppes, meeting in battles that would reshape the subcontinent's destiny for centuries to come. The great metropolis trembled behind walls that had withstood countless invasions, its current master, Mahmud Tughlaq, ruling over a sultanate weakened by decades of internal strife. Once mighty enough to command the entire Gangetic plain, the remnants of the dynasty now controlled little beyond their seat. Provincial governors had declared independence, rival claimants disputed the throne, and the treasury stood nearly empty. This decay presented exactly the opportunity that the Iron Lord had been seeking, a wealthy target grown soft through prosperity and division, ripe for harvesting by disciplined troops led with tactical brilliance. The challenge of reaching the Gangetic plain would test even his legendary organizational skills. Separating the valleys of Transoxiana from the prize beyond lay mountain ranges where the very air grew thin enough to kill strong men, passes blocked by snow for half the year. No previous conqueror had attempted to move such large hosts across these obstacles during winter's depths, but winter offered advantages that outweighed its dangers. The seasonal rains that turned the subcontinent's waterways into impassable torrents would be frozen solid, creating highways where none existed during warmer months. Enemy scouts expecting spring invasions would be caught unprepared. Most importantly, the timing would demonstrate that no natural obstacle could deter warriors guided by divine purpose. Among the most crucial preliminary successes was the capture of Multan, that ancient crossroads where trade routes converged before flowing toward the Gangetic plain. The settlement's massive walls and position astride the Indus had made it virtually impregnable to conventional assault, yet its defenders found themselves facing innovations that rendered defenses obsolete. Massive trebuchets hurled stones with mathematical precision, while miners tunneled beneath foundations. More significantly, The psychological impact of Multan's fall rippled throughout Hindustan like earthquake tremors, announcing that a new player had entered regional politics. The systematic destruction that followed served notice that this northern invader differed fundamentally from previous raiders who had been content with plunder and tribute. From Multan, the host began its descent toward the heartland, following routes that had carried countless previous invaders, but never troops of such size during the harshest months. Each day's march brought new challenges as the climate shifted from harsh mountain cold to humid valley warmth, requiring constant adjustments in equipment and formations. Yet the very audacity of the enterprise demoralized potential opponents who had expected months of preparation time. Intelligence gathered by advanced scouts painted an increasingly clear picture of the situation awaiting them. Mahmud Tughluk's troops showed little cohesion or morale after years of internecine warfare. Provincial governors who might have provided assistance had grown too accustomed to independence. Most tellingly, the treasury's emptiness meant that even loyal commanders lacked resources to pay their soldiers. This financial weakness opened opportunities for a conqueror whose coffers overflowed with accumulated riches. Gold could accomplish what violence alone might find difficult, turning enemy commanders into allies, transforming potential resistance into collaboration. The art lay in determining which opponents could be bought and which required elimination. Yet beneath these practical calculations lay deeper motivations that transformed what might have been mere predatory raiding into holy mission. The doctrinal framework he had absorbed from Sufi teachers presented the subjugation of Hindu kingdoms, not simply as profitable adventure, but as righteous correction of a world grown corrupt through tolerance of practices that contaminated pure monotheism. This sacred dimension proved crucial in maintaining the devotion of his predominantly Muslim warriors during expeditions that stretched their endurance to breaking points. Fighters who might have questioned the wisdom of crossing elevated terrain in winter could find inspiration in the conviction that their sufferings served holy purposes. Each temple destroyed, each idol broken, each forced conversion represented cleansing that would earn divine favor. The approach to the great metropolis itself unfolded with theatrical precision, designed to maximize both effectiveness and psychological impact. Rather than advancing directly along obvious routes, which enemy troops might have fortified, he chose indirect approaches that brought his warriors to the seat's gates from unexpected directions. This tactical surprise prevented Mahmud Tughluk from implementing whatever defensive preparations he might have managed during the brief time available. When battle was finally joined outside the walls, the encounter demonstrated with devastating clarity the gulf that separated disciplined professionalism from amateur enthusiasm. Mahmud's troops, consisting largely of hastily assembled militias and mercenaries, dissolved under coordinated assault. The Sultan's famous war elephants proved helpless before archers, who had learned to target their drivers and mounted units that could strike from multiple directions simultaneously. Victory in the field, however, merely provided the prelude to the real purpose: the systematic exploitation of accumulated riches and the demonstration of what awaited any who dared oppose divine will. The sack that followed would be remembered for centuries as a masterpiece of organized destruction, serving both practical and symbolic purposes with surgical precision. The inhabitants faced sorting according to criteria that reflected both calculation and conviction. Members of the old ruling class found themselves marked for elimination, their deaths preventing future claims, while demonstrating the futility of opposing divine will. Clerics who had supported Hindu practices met similar fates, their destruction sending clear messages about the consequences of promoting corruption. Yet craftsmen, merchants, and farmers who possessed useful skills discovered that compliance could earn not merely survival, but advancement under new management. The destruction of Hindu temples throughout the metropolis served multiple audiences with carefully calibrated symbolic impact. To his Muslim followers, these actions demonstrated their leader's commitment to purifying the faith from contamination by polytheistic practices. To the conquered inhabitants, the systematic elimination of their sacred sites announced the arrival of a new order that would tolerate no rival sources of divine guidance. To potential enemies throughout Hindustan, the completeness of the destruction promised similar treatment for any who chose defiance. Yet perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the entire operation lay in its deliberate temporality. He never intended to remain in the subcontinent as a permanent sovereign, having recognized that governing such distant territories would strain his resources beyond sustainable limits. Instead, the expedition served as a massive harvesting operation, designed to extract maximum riches while demonstrating the reach of his influence. When the host finally departed, it carried not merely portable treasure, but also thousands of skilled workers whose expertise would enrich his seat while impoverishing potential rivals. The withdrawal across the peaks proved even more challenging than the initial descent, as baggage trains swollen with plunder and captives moved slowly through passes now blocked by seasonal snows. Yet the very success of this seemingly impossible logistics exercise enhanced his reputation throughout the realm of believers, proving that no distance was too great, no obstacle too formidable for troops guided by divine favor and superior organization. From the riches extracted during these operations, he could finance even more ambitious projects that would extend his influence across an ever-widening circle of territories. Each successful expedition generated resources for the next, creating a self-sustaining cycle of growth that seemed limited only by the physical endurance of his warriors and the geographical boundaries of the known world. Eastern Persia and Afghanistan became the next theaters for applying lessons learned during the venture, as local rulers who had maintained precarious independence found themselves facing choices between voluntary compliance and forcible incorporation. Settlements like Kandahar and Balkh, those ancient crossroads where Central Asian trade routes converged, discovered that their location made them inevitable targets for a conqueror seeking to control the flow of commerce between East and West. The deployment of mixed hosts that combined traditional nomadic mobility with newer technologies of wall breaking created tactical capabilities that no previous conqueror had possessed. Rapid mounted units could strike deep into enemy territory to disrupt communications and supply lines, while specialists could reduce supposedly impregnable strongholds with methodical precision. This combination of mobility and projection enabled operations across distances that would have been impossible for purely nomadic warriors, while maintaining the speed of advance that purely sedentary armies could never achieve. Yet the true innovation lay not in these technological adaptations, but in the administrative systems that enabled coordination of multiple armies operating across vast distances simultaneously. Communication networks using mounted couriers could maintain contact between troops separated by thousands of miles, while standardized procedures ensured that local commanders could implement directives without requiring constant supervision from headquarters. The personal devotion that bound this vast organization together reflected his genius for inspiring allegiance among followers who served him not merely from fear or hope of material gain, but from genuine conviction that his cause represented divine will, made manifest in earthly affairs. This dimension proved crucial during expeditions that demanded extraordinary sacrifices from participants. As his warriors completed the domination of eastern Persia and established secure control over the passes that connected Central Asia with Hindustan, his gaze began to turn toward even more distant horizons. Reports from merchants and diplomats spoke of the Ming dynasty's growing strength in China, where a resurgent native house had expelled the rulers and established control over territories that had once acknowledged the supremacy of Genghis Khan's descendants. This Chinese revival represented both opportunity and challenge for a conqueror who claimed to embody the restoration of steppe greatness. On one hand, the overthrow of traditional rule in China provided justification for an expedition of restoration that would reclaim lost territories for their rightful masters. On the other hand, the Ming had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything possessed by previous enemies, particularly in the sophisticated use of gunpowder weapons and defensive works designed specifically to counter nomadic tactics. The logistical challenges of mounting such an expedition would dwarf anything previously attempted, requiring the coordination of multiple armies across distances measured in thousands of miles, while maintaining supply lines that stretched beyond the limits of conventional science. Yet the potential rewards matched the enormous risks. Successful domination of China would establish him as the greatest conqueror in human history, while providing resources that could fund unlimited future growth. Yet even as these preparations proceeded, fate was weaving patterns that would render all such plans irrelevant. The same iron constitution that had carried him through decades of expeditions in climates ranging from Arctic steppes to subtropical valleys was beginning to show signs of accumulated strain. The approaching winter of 1404 to 1405 after Christ would test not merely his physical endurance, but the fundamental stability of a realm that had been built around the personal leadership of a single extraordinary individual. Standing at the zenith of his influence, master of territories that stretched from the Mediterranean to the borders of China, he gazed toward horizons that promised even greater triumphs for those bold enough to seize them. The Eastern expeditions had demonstrated that no natural barrier could contain warriors guided by superior planning and divine favor, while the riches extracted from conquered territories provided resources for enterprises limited only by human imagination and ambition. Yet the very magnitude of these achievements contained within them the seeds of future challenges that would test whether the realm he had built could survive the transition from personal leadership to institutional control. The question that would determine the fate of millions lay not in the strength of his armies or the abundance of his treasury, but in whether the synthesis of customs he had forged could maintain its coherence without the iron will that had brought it into being. Winter winds whispered across the steppes of Central Asia, carrying with them the scent of snow and the promise of trials yet to come. In felt tents and marble palaces, in elevated strongholds and lowland settlements, the subjects of the world's greatest realm waited to learn whether the spring would bring new triumphs or new uncertainties, whether the force that had reshaped the map of the known world possessed the stability to endure beyond the life of its creator. Bitter winds swept across the steppes near Otrar as the year 1405 after Christ drew toward its close, carrying with them the scent of snow and the whisper of approaching destiny. Within the felt pavilions of the greatest host ever assembled for a Chinese expedition, physicians moved with quiet urgency among their most illustrious patient, their faces grave with knowledge they dared not speak aloud. The Iron Lord, master of half the known world, lay upon silken cushions that could not soften the harsh reality closing around him like winter shadows. For months, the signs had been accumulating, a persistent fever that no medicine could break, a weariness that seemed to seep into his very bones. Moments of confusion that flickered across features that had once radiated absolute certainty. Yet even as his body betrayed the accumulated toll of a lifetime spent in the saddle, campaigning across climates that ranged from Arctic tundra to subtropical river valleys, his mind remained fixed upon the greatest prize of all, the restoration of Mongol rule over the Middle Kingdom that had expelled Genghis Khan's descendants nearly a century before. Never in his 7 decades of life had such an ambitious enterprise beckoned so tantalizingly within reach. Advanced scouts had mapped the routes through the Tian Shan passes. Supply depots stretched in careful intervals across the approaches to the Chinese frontier. And diplomatic envoys had already begun the delicate work of identifying potential allies among the Ming dynasty's numerous enemies. The very audacity of launching such an expedition during winter demonstrated the same calculated boldness that had carried him to victory from the Mediterranean shores to the banks of the Ganges. Yet fate, that stern arbiter of human ambition, had woven different patterns into the tapestry of destiny. On a night when the stars burned with particular brilliance above the frozen steppes, the greatest conqueror of the age drew his final breath, leaving behind a realm that stretched across 3 continents, but whose future hung as uncertain as morning mist above a battlefield. In that moment of transformation, the question that would determine the fate of millions crystallized with devastating clarity. Could an edifice built around the personal genius of one extraordinary individual survive the transition to institutional control? Word of the supreme commander's death spread through the vast encampment like wildfire racing across dried grass, each messenger carrying with him not merely news, but the seeds of change that would reshape the landscape of Asia. Within hours, the carefully orchestrated unity that had characterized the expedition began to fracture along lines of kinship, ambition, and regional loyalty that personal charisma had previously held in delicate balance. Among the first to learn of their grandfather's passing were the royal princes who had served as his primary lieutenants throughout the later expeditions, each commanding substantial forces and governing crucial domains in his name. Khalil, grandson through the line of Jahangir, controlled the heartland of Transoxiana from his base in the Great Crossroads, while the prince of the eastern lands, son of the deceased conqueror, administered the wealthy province from the magnificent settlement that would become his seat. Between these two lay not merely geographical distance, but fundamentally different visions of what the realm should become. The younger claimant embodied the warrior tradition that had elevated his family from regional chieftains to masters of the known world, believing that the path forward lay in maintaining the aggressive expansionism that had brought such spectacular success. Young, energetic, and possessed of considerable martial talent, he commanded the loyalty of many among the tribal elements who saw in him a continuation of the virtues that had made their people great. His control of the magnificent crossroads, where the wealth of continents converged, provided him with both symbolic standing and practical resources that made his claim to inheritance appear nearly irresistible. Separated by deserts and mountains, his uncle in the eastern provinces represented another kind of leadership, tempered by the fatigue of a world long ravaged by war. Older, more cautious, and deeply influenced by the Persian cultural renaissance that had flowered under his father's patronage, he believed that the future lay not in endless campaigns, but in the careful strengthening of existing domains. His management of the eastern provinces had demonstrated remarkable skill in balancing the competing demands of nomadic warriors and sedentary populations, creating prosperity that served both groups while maintaining the delicate equilibrium necessary for stable rule. Between these two primary claimants stood a constellation of lesser princes provincial governors, and commanders, each controlling sufficient resources to tip the balance in any struggle, while pursuing their own calculations of advantage and survival. The tribal councils that had traditionally validated leadership changes in the steppes found themselves confronting choices of unprecedented complexity, as the sheer scale of the realm made it impossible for any single leader to command universal recognition through personal charisma alone. Adding further complications to an already volatile situation, the realm's western lands began asserting independence almost immediately upon news of the central command's demise. Local governors, who had maintained their positions through careful balancing of regional interests against distant demands, suddenly found themselves free to pursue policies that served their immediate constituencies rather than far-off objectives. Iraq descended into factional warfare as competing claimants sought to establish control over the wealthy Mesopotamian cities, while Anatolia witnessed the resurgence of Turkish beyliks that had been suppressed but never entirely eliminated. In the Caucasus, tribal chieftains who had submitted to overlordship out of necessity rather than conviction began testing the resolve of garrison commanders, whose loyalty to the new regime remained questionable. The careful network of alliances and intimidation that had maintained order across these diverse lands required constant reinforcement from a central command that no longer possessed the unified will necessary to project effective force across such vast distances. Perhaps most significantly, the crisis revealed fundamental weaknesses in the systems that had enabled rapid expansion, but had never been designed to function during periods of contested command. Communication networks that depended upon the prestige of messengers found their effectiveness compromised when recipients questioned whether those messengers truly represented legitimate force. Tax collection mechanisms that had extracted enormous revenues from conquered lands began breaking down, as local officials withheld tribute pending clarification of who possessed the right to receive it. Despite the outward chaos, certain institutional frameworks remained intact, surprising those who had predicted their downfall. The bureaucratic apparatus that had grown up around the court, staffed largely by Persian officials who had learned to serve whatever command could maintain order, continued functioning with remarkable efficiency despite the upheaval. These skilled professionals understood that their own survival depended upon the preservation of governmental continuity, leading them to support whichever claimant seemed most likely to provide stable leadership, regardless of their personal loyalties. Similarly, the merchant communities that had prospered under protection recognized that their continued prosperity required the maintenance of trade routes and commercial regulations that transcended individual dynasties. Their financial support, while not decisive in martial terms, provided crucial resources for leaders who could demonstrate both the ability and the intention to restore the economic stability that had made the realm profitable for all participants. The pivotal moment in determining the domain's future came when the Eastern Prince demonstrated the wisdom that would define his reign by choosing strengthening over confrontation. Rather than immediately challenging his nephew's control of the Great Crossroads, he focused on reinforcing his position in the eastern provinces, while presenting himself as the candidate of stability and continuity. This approach proved particularly effective among the war-weary populations of the realm's core lands, who had grown prosperous under rule but had little appetite for the renewed warfare that struggles typically entailed. His marriage to Gauhar Shad, a woman of remarkable intelligence and acumen, provided him with an invaluable partner whose influence extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of female participation in Central Asian societies. Descended from prominent Chagatai nobility and possessed of extensive connections throughout the Persian elite, she served as both advisor and active participant in the delicate negotiations that gradually built support for her husband's claim to supreme command. Gawar Shah's support of religious institutions and projects served strategic as well as aesthetic purposes, demonstrating the regime's commitment to the synthesis of Islamic piety and Persian refinement that had become characteristic of the dynasty's approach. Her sponsorship of architectural works in the eastern capital transformed that settlement into a worthy rival of the great crossroads, while her support for scholars and artists attracted talent from across the Islamic world and beyond. Through a combination of martial pressure, diplomatic negotiation, and simple attrition, the Eastern Prince gradually extended his influence over most of the realm's eastern lands. His nephew's early advantages in terms of location and resources proved insufficient to overcome his lack of experience, and his failure to build the broad coalitions necessary for ruling such diverse populations. His reign in the crossroads, though it lasted several years, never achieved the stability necessary for long-term success. By 1409 after Christ, the Eastern Prince had established effective control over domains stretching from the Caspian Sea to the borders of India, though he made no serious attempt to reclaim the western provinces that had achieved de facto independence during the crisis. This strategic restraint reflected a mature understanding of the relationship between ambition and capability that his father had sometimes lacked, recognizing that sustainable rule required matching territorial extent to capacity. His approach to rule emphasized continuity with the established traditions that had made the realm successful, while adapting those traditions to the changed circumstances that followed the founder's death. The forces remained organized according to the decimal system that had proven so effective, but with greater emphasis on maintaining garrison troops for territorial defense, rather than assembling massive expeditionary hosts for distant campaigns. Procedures continued to balance the demands of Islamic law with the practical requirements of governing diverse populations, but with increased attention to local autonomy within the framework of unity. Perhaps most significantly, this reign witnessed the emergence of a distinctive synthesis of command, patronage, and religious expression. Unlike his father, whose standing had rested primarily upon martial success and personal charisma, the Eastern Prince grounded his position in demonstrable competence as an overseer and patron of the arts and sciences that gave meaning to civilized life. This transformation reflected not merely personal preference, but a sophisticated understanding of how command could be maintained across domains too vast for any individual to control through direct personal intervention. By establishing his court as a center of learning and artistic achievement that attracted talent from across the known world, he created sources of standing that complemented and ultimately transcended the martial foundations upon which the realm had originally been built. Under his patronage, the Eastern capital became renowned throughout the Islamic world as a center of scholarship that rivaled the great universities of Cairo, Damascus, and Cordoba. The libraries that accumulated there preserved not only the classical heritage of Greek philosophy and Persian poetry, but also the mathematical and astronomical knowledge that Chinese scholars had developed over centuries of careful observation. This intellectual synthesis created new possibilities for understanding both the natural world and humanity's place within it. The court workshops that produced manuscripts, textiles, and metalwork under royal support set standards of craftsmanship that influenced artistic production from Istanbul to Delhi. The distinctive style that emerged from this creative ferment combined the geometric precision characteristic of Islamic decorative traditions with the naturalistic elements that Persian artists had inherited from their ancient predecessors, creating aesthetic innovations that would influence artistic development for centuries to come. For all its outward brilliance, The real test lay in keeping a grip on lands too varied to move in unison. The realm that the Eastern Prince inherited encompassed nomadic pastoralists and settled farmers, Sunni and Shia Muslims, Persian speakers and Turkic tribes, mountain dwellers and desert nomads, each group possessing its own traditions and interests that required careful balancing to prevent destructive conflict. His success in managing these centrifugal forces demonstrated remarkable skill, but it also revealed the fundamental tension between the ideal of universal command and the practical limitations that geography and culture imposed upon any attempt to govern such vast domains from a single center. The solution that emerged during his reign involved a careful decentralization that preserved unity in matters of crucial importance while allowing substantial local autonomy in affairs that affected individual communities more directly. This balance between coordination and flexibility would prove to be one of the most enduring contributions of the dynasty's system to the development of Islamic thought. By demonstrating that effective rule could accommodate diversity without sacrificing unity, this reign provided a model that would influence subsequent attempts to organize large-scale entities throughout the Islamic world and beyond. As the second decade of the 15th century drew toward its close, the realm that had emerged from the crisis bore little resemblance to the juggernaut that had terrorized 3 continents under its founder's command. Yet in many ways, this transformation represented not decline, but maturation. The evolution from a system dependent upon the extraordinary capabilities of a single individual to one that could function effectively through mechanisms designed to outlast any particular ruler. The death of the great conqueror had indeed marked the end of an era, but it had also marked the beginning of a different kind of greatness, one that would be measured not in cities conquered or enemies slaughtered, but in the creation of achievements that would outlive the bronze and steel that had originally established the dynasty's force, in palaces and gardens, in libraries and workshops, in the measured verses of poets and the precise calculations of astronomers. A new chapter in the story was beginning to unfold. Gardens bloomed in the shadow of war-torn walls as the Eastern Prince transformed his realm into something the world had never witnessed. A domain where the sword yielded precedence to the pen, where astronomical calculations commanded more respect than siege engines, and where the greatest treasures lay not in conquered gold, but in the verses of poets and the wisdom of philosophers. Under his patronage and that of his remarkable son, the lands that had known only the thunder of hoofbeats and the clash of bronze would echo instead, with the measured cadences of scholarship and the delicate harmonies of music. Within the rose-scented chambers of the eastern capital, scribes labored over illuminated texts whose margins bloomed with colors more precious than rubies, their brushes capturing not merely words, but entire universes of meaning that would outlive the stones of the palaces that sheltered them. This was the paradox that would define the Golden Age, that the heirs of history's most fearsome destroyer should become the patrons of its most sublime creations, transforming the wealth extracted through terror into monuments of beauty that would inspire wonder for centuries to come. At the heart of this transformation stood the great prince, whose name carried such meaning, but whose true greatness lay not in the territories he commanded, but in his mastery of the celestial sphere that wheeled overhead in eternal majesty. Born to lead armies, he chose instead to command the stars themselves, establishing in his northern capital an observatory that would rival any institute from Cordoba to Beijing, where the movements of planets could be calculated with precision that astounded learned men from across the known world. Rising like a geometric dream from the earth of Samarkand, the Fakhri sextant stretched 40 meters into the azure sky, its marble arc calibrated to measure the positions of celestial bodies with accuracy that would not be exceeded for centuries to come. Within its shadow, mathematicians from Persia worked alongside astronomers from India and engineers from China, their diverse backgrounds blending into new forms of understanding that transcended the boundaries that had previously separated one civilization from another. The prince astronomer's greatest achievement lay not in any single discovery, but in the comprehensive catalogue of stellar positions that his observations produced. The royal tables, which recorded the locations of nearly 1,000 stars with precision that remained unmatched until the age of telescopes. Night after night, he climbed the steps of his great instrument, his royal robes replaced by the simple garments of a student, his crown set aside for the astrolabe that became his true scepter. For all its brilliance, the monument could not guard him from the ancestral patterns of bloodshed that continued to define his lineage. In 1449 after Christ, the prince fell victim to the same forces of ambition and betrayal that had claimed so many of his lineage, struck down by assassins acting on behalf of his own son, who had grown weary of waiting for an inheritance that seemed forever delayed by scholarly pursuits. The irony cut deeper than any blade, that one who had mapped the eternal movements of the heavens should be destroyed by the temporary passions of earthly politics. His death marked not merely the loss of an individual genius, but the end of an age when scientific inquiry could flourish under royal protection in lands where such pursuits had previously been unknown. The observatory fell into disrepair, its instruments abandoned to the desert winds that had witnessed the rise and fall of so many human ambitions. Yet the understanding it had produced survived in texts that carried the fruits of its labors to distant libraries, where future generations would marvel at the precision achieved by these medieval stargazers. Meanwhile, in the gardens and lecture halls of the eastern capital, a different kind of renaissance was reaching its peak under the continued support of the aging prince who had chosen strengthening over expansion. Here, the Persian tongue underwent a transformation that elevated it from the practical language of administration into a vehicle for literary artistry that could rival Arabic in its theological subtlety and Greek in its philosophical precision. Jami, the greatest Sufi poet of his age, walked these same garden paths where nightingales sang among roses that bloomed in defiance of the harsh realities beyond the palace walls. His verses wove together the mystical streams of Islamic spirituality with the aesthetic refinements that Persian culture had developed over centuries of creative ferment, creating poetry that spoke simultaneously to the heart that yearned for divine union and the mind that sought to understand the nature of existence itself. Beside him moved Alisher whose pen transformed the Turkic speech of the palaces into an instrument capable of expressing the most sophisticated philosophical concepts and the most delicate emotional nuances. His works demonstrated that the tongues of the steppes could achieve heights previously reserved for the classical languages of scholarship, opening new possibilities for literary creation that honored both the nomadic heritage of the family and the sedentary customs it had absorbed through dominion and assimilation. In the workshops where master craftsmen labored under royal support, Kamal al-Din Bizad revolutionized the art of manuscript illumination, developing techniques that brought unprecedented realism and emotional depth to the painted figures that adorned the pages of literary classics. His brushwork captured not merely the external appearance of his subjects, but their inner lives as well, creating portraits that seemed to breathe with the same intensity of feeling that animated the verses they illustrated. Under his influence, the miniature painting styles that had developed in various regional centers began to coalesce into a distinctive approach that combined the geometric precision of Islamic decorative arts with the naturalistic observation that had long characterized Persian visual arts. The results transcended mere illustration to become independent works that could stand comparison with the greatest accomplishments of any school. These flowerings did not occur in isolation from the practical concerns of governance, but rather emerged from the deliberate policies of leaders who understood that lasting greatness required more than military success. The Eastern Prince had recognized that his family's survival depended upon its ability to inspire genuine devotion among subjects who had grown accustomed to prosperity and stability. Devotion that could not be maintained through fear alone, but required the creation of shared values that transcended ethnic and regional divisions. The library that he established in his capital became more than a repository of texts. It served as a living institution where learned men from diverse backgrounds could collaborate in the preservation and advancement of human understanding. Chinese mathematicians worked alongside Arab physicians, Persian historians debated with Turkish legal experts, and Indian astronomers shared their observations with colleagues whose own backgrounds stretched back to the classical civilizations of antiquity. This intellectual fusion produced innovations that neither background could have achieved in isolation. Mathematical techniques developed in India were combined with geometric principles inherited from Greek sources to solve problems that had puzzled thinkers for centuries. Celestial observations made in Central Asia were compared with records maintained in Chinese archives to produce more accurate models of heavenly mechanics. Medical wisdom accumulated in the Islamic world was enhanced by diagnostic techniques that physicians from the subcontinent had perfected through generations of practice. The guest house system that facilitated these scholarly exchanges represented one of the family's most sophisticated innovations in diplomacy. Visitors who could demonstrate genuine expertise in any field of study found themselves welcomed with honors that exceeded those typically accorded to foreign ambassadors. Their material needs provided for while they pursued their research and contributed to the collective enterprise of advancing human understanding. This systematic attraction of talent served multiple purposes beyond its immediate intellectual benefits. It demonstrated to neighboring potentates that the realm had become the premier center of learning in the Islamic world, attracting minds who might otherwise have served rival powers. It created networks of personal bonds that extended far beyond the family's borders, as beneficiaries of royal support became informal ambassadors for the regime's prestige and values. Perhaps most importantly, it established the realm's identity as something more than a mere entity. It became the embodiment of an ideal that transcended the temporary boundaries imposed by military dominion. Even territories that achieved independence continued to acknowledge the intellectual and aesthetic leadership of palaces that had demonstrated their commitment to the highest accomplishments of human civilization. The architectural monuments that rose during this period reflected the same fusion of customs that characterized the era's literary and scientific accomplishments. The great madrasa complexes that transformed the urban landscape combined functional requirements with aesthetic ambitions that pushed the boundaries of what contemporary engineering could accomplish. Their turquoise domes caught and reflected the desert light in patterns that seemed to capture something of the cosmic harmonies that the palace astronomers studied in their observations of the celestial sphere. In those decades, the great square that emerged in the northern capital proved that thoughtful design could serve both daily needs and deeper meaning. The careful proportions of its component buildings created visual harmonies that pleased the eye, while their functional arrangements facilitated the complex activities of a major commercial and intellectual hub. Students hurrying to lectures moved through the same spaces where merchants displayed goods from across the known world, creating daily interactions between the practical and theoretical aspects of human endeavor. Yet beneath this flowering lay persistent tensions that no amount of aesthetic achievement could entirely resolve. The family's domains encompassed populations whose customs and interests often conflicted in ways that required constant mediation from central authorities. Nomadic tribes who valued martial prowess above scholarly pursuits sometimes questioned whether resources devoted to libraries and observatories might be better spent on maintaining the military strength that had originally established the bloodline's dominance. Religious authorities, while generally supportive of study that enhanced understanding of divine revelation, occasionally voiced concern about investigations into natural philosophy that seemed to challenge established interpretations of sacred texts. The delicate balance between rational inquiry and revealed truth required careful navigation by leaders who needed to maintain the devotion of both learned elites and popular movements. Regional governors who administered distant provinces sometimes found their standing undermined by local populations who looked to the centers for guidance on matters that had previously been resolved through established channels. The soft influence exercised by palaces that had become magnets for talent could prove more decisive than the hard force of military garrisons in determining the allegiance of populations whose prosperity depended upon participation in trade networks that transcended boundaries. Economic pressures also created constraints that even the wealthiest leaders could not entirely ignore. The support system that sustained hundreds of learned men, artists, and craftsmen required enormous expenditures that had to be balanced against the costs of maintaining military forces and administrative bureaucracies. Trade revenues that had seemed inexhaustible during periods of expansion sometimes proved insufficient to fund all the projects that ambitious patrons wished to undertake. Moreover, the very success of the hubs in attracting talent from across the known world created expectations that became increasingly difficult to fulfill. Each new generation of thinkers expected to surpass the accomplishments of their predecessors, while each new group of artists sought to develop styles that would establish their own distinctive contributions to the evolving streams they had inherited. The competitive dynamics that emerged between different palaces within the family's domains sometimes worked to the benefit of scholarship and art, as leaders sought to outdo their relatives in the magnificence of their support and the brilliance of the talent they could attract. Yet this same competition could also lead to the fragmentation of resources and the creation of rival hubs that weakened the overall coherence of the fusion that had been achieved. As the middle decades of the 15th century unfolded, observers throughout the Islamic world began to recognize that something unprecedented was taking place in the lands that had once known only the sound of war. Here, in territories that had been conquered through the systematic application of terror, had emerged establishments dedicated to the patient pursuit of truth and beauty that represented the highest aspirations of human civilization. The transformation seemed to contradict everything that contemporary wisdom suggested about the relationship between force and culture. According to conventional understanding, military dominion destroyed rather than created the conditions necessary for aesthetic and intellectual achievement. Yet the family's experience demonstrated that destruction and creativity could be linked in ways that few observers had previously imagined possible. The wealth that had been extracted through dominion provided the material foundation for support that exceeded anything available to leaders whose resources derived from more peaceful sources. The cosmopolitan character of the domains created opportunities for exchange that would have been impossible within the boundaries of more homogeneous societies. The prestige that derived from military success gave the family's patrons the confidence to attempt projects whose scope and ambition might have seemed presumptuous to leaders whose standing rested on less spectacular foundations. Perhaps most importantly, the family's leaders possessed the security that came from knowing that their dominance was sufficiently well established to allow them to pursue long-term projects whose benefits would not be apparent for decades. Unlike those who faced immediate threats to their survival, they could afford to invest in establishments whose value lay not in their immediate practical utility, but in their contribution to the accumulated wealth of human achievement. Standing in the gardens where poets once walked while composing verses that would outlive the palaces that sheltered them, modern visitors can still sense something of the extraordinary fusion that was achieved during these golden decades. The roses still bloom with the same intensity that inspired Jamie's mystical metaphors, while the geometric patterns that adorn the surviving monuments continue to demonstrate the mathematical principles that the prince astronomer's followers employed in their calculations of celestial mechanics. Perhaps the most enduring inheritance of this flowering lies not in any particular accomplishment, but in the demonstration it provided that human creativity could transcend the circumstances of its origin. The same energies that had once been channeled into warfare found outlet in pursuits that enriched rather than impoverished the world, proving that even the most destructive forces could be transformed into instruments of beauty when guided by wisdom and inspired by authentic vision. Twilight crept across the eastern provinces like a thief approaching a weakened household, carrying with it the scent of ending that no amount of past glory could dispel. In 1447 after Christ, as the great patron of learning and the arts breathed his last within the rose-scented chambers he had transformed into monuments of human achievement, the question that had haunted his reign finally demanded its answer. Could the fusion of warrior customs and scholarly refinement survive the death of the vision that had brought it into being? News of the eastern prince's passing spread through his domains, like ripples across a disturbed pool, each wave carrying with it the seeds of dissolution that would test every bond his wisdom had forged during 4 decades of careful rule. The libraries that had attracted the finest minds from across the known world suddenly found their future uncertain, while the workshops where master craftsmen had perfected their arts wondered whether new patrons would value beauty as highly as their departed benefactor had done. Within months of the funeral ceremonies that had drawn mourners from every corner of the Islamic world, the carefully balanced equilibrium that had maintained peace among the bloodline's various branches began to fracture along lines of inheritance that no amount of past cooperation could bridge. Brothers who had served faithfully as provincial governors while their father lived now found themselves rivals for an estate whose value transcended mere territorial control to encompass the very identity of what the realm might become. Abu Sa'id, inheriting the heartland domains from his father's seat, possessed neither the intellectual curiosity that had made his predecessor a patron of astronomers, nor the administrative genius that had enabled the transformation of warfare into culture. Young, impetuous, and surrounded by advisors who remembered the days when the house's greatness had been measured in cities taken rather than books copied, he represented a return to the martial virtues that had originally elevated the lineage above its competitors. Still, the world into which he stepped bore little resemblance to the fractured landscape that his ancestors had conquered through superior organization and ruthless determination. New forces had emerged during the decades of peace, entities that combined established strengths with innovations that challenged every assumption about how warfare should be conducted. To the west, the Kara Koyunlu and Aku Koyunlu confederations had consolidated control over lands that had once acknowledged the house's supremacy, while their growing wealth enabled them to recruit the finest talent from across the region. More ominously still, reports from the western borders spoke of a new movement arising in the territories that had once formed the heartland of the ancient Persian domains. The Safavids, claiming descent from the mystical orders that had long provided spiritual guidance to the common people, combined religious fervor with ambitions in ways that threatened to overturn the entire balance that had governed regional politics for generations. Under the leadership of Ismail, a youth whose charisma seemed to burn with the intensity of divine inspiration, this emerging force proclaimed the restoration of Shia orthodoxy as its sacred mission, while simultaneously asserting claims to temporal command that challenged every existing ruler from Anatolia to the Oxus. His followers, known as the Qizilbash, for the distinctive red headgear that marked their devotion, fought with the fanatical courage of men convinced that death in battle would guarantee immediate entry into paradise. Against such opponents, the established advantages that had served the house so well during its years of expansion proved insufficient to guarantee continued dominance. The decimal organization that had once enabled rapid deployment of overwhelming force across vast distances now seemed cumbersome when facing enemies who employed guerrilla tactics that rendered conventional formations ineffective. The siege technologies that had reduced the mightiest fortresses to rubble proved useless against adversaries who avoided pitched battles in favor of raids that struck without warning and vanished before effective response could be organized. Most critically, the new enemies possessed something that the house's forces increasingly lacked: the innovations in gunpowder weapons that were transforming the nature of combat throughout the known world. Where previous generations of warriors had relied upon the composite bow and the curved sword to establish their superiority, the emerging powers deployed cannons that could breach walls previously thought impregnable, and matchlock firearms that could stop cavalry charges that had once seemed irresistible. The failure to adapt to these technological changes reflected deeper problems that went beyond mere considerations of war. The very success of the Renaissance that had flourished under previous generations had created a court culture that valued aesthetic refinement over martial prowess, producing leaders who were more comfortable discussing poetry than planning campaigns. The administrators who had learned to govern through negotiation and compromise found themselves ill-equipped to respond to challenges that could only be met through decisive action. Economic factors also contributed to the growing weakness that undermined the realm's ability to respond effectively to external threats. The routes that had once provided enormous revenues began to shift as new maritime passages reduced the importance of the overland connections that Central Asian cities had controlled for centuries. Portuguese navigators, who had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, could now transport spices from India to European markets without passing through the established commercial centers, reducing the customs revenues that had funded previous expeditions. Simultaneously, the costs of maintaining the establishments that had become symbols of the house's identity continued to rise even as the resources available to support them diminished. Libraries required constant additions to remain current, with intellectual developments occurring throughout the Islamic world, while workshops needed expensive materials to produce the luxury goods that distinguished court production from ordinary craftsmanship. The tension between ambitions and fiscal reality created difficult choices that no amount of administrative skill could entirely resolve. Provincial governors who had once competed for the honor of contributing to central projects now found themselves struggling to maintain basic security within their own domains. The loyalty that had bound local elites to the central command began to erode as immediate interests diverged from imperial policies that seemed increasingly irrelevant to survival needs. What had once been a unified realm began to fragment into autonomous principalities, held together more by habit than by any compelling vision of shared destiny. The rise of Muhammad Shaybani Khan represented the most serious external challenge to the house's continued survival. Embodying as he did a return to the pure nomadic customs that critics claimed the realm had abandoned in its pursuit of sedentary refinement. Leading a confederation of Uzbek tribes that had maintained their way of life despite the changes occurring throughout Central Asia, he presented himself as the true heir to Genghis Khan's inheritance, promising to restore the martial virtues that had once made the steppes the terror of the settled world. His organization reflected hard-learned lessons about the limitations of purely customary approaches to warfare, while avoiding the compromises that had supposedly weakened his opponents. The Uzbek forces combined the mobility and endurance that had always characterized steppe armies, with selective adoption of gunpowder weapons that enhanced their striking capability without requiring fundamental changes to their tactical methods or social structure. More importantly, Shaybani Khan possessed the ideological clarity that his opponents seemed to have lost during their transformation from conquerors into patrons, where the house's representatives spoke in sophisticated terms about the fusion of customs and the balance of competing interests. He offered simple messages about the restoration of authentic practices and the rejection of foreign influences that had corrupted the pure inheritance of the steppes. The appeal of such rhetoric proved particularly strong among populations that had grown weary of the complex administrative arrangements that had characterized recent rule. Tribal groups that had been integrated into imperial structures without fully abandoning their loyalties found themselves attracted to leaders who promised a return to the straightforward relationships that had governed steppe politics before the complications introduced by sedentary influences. The confrontation that would determine the realm's fate began to take shape as the 15th century drew toward its close, with both sides recognizing that the coming struggle would decide more than territorial boundaries. For the house, defeat would mean not merely the loss of control, but the end of the synthesis that had been their greatest achievement. For their opponents, victory would validate their claims about the superiority of customs over the innovations that had supposedly weakened the authentic inheritance of the steppes. Though descended from the original conqueror, the young prince had known only provincial rule in Fergana, before being thrust into the heart of a crumbling empire. Born into a world where the house's greatness was already more memory than reality, he inherited not the vast domains that his ancestors had ruled, but rather a precarious position that required constant defense against neighbors who sensed weakness like wolves scenting wounded prey. His early attempts to reclaim the ancestral seat ended in humiliating reversals that demonstrated how thoroughly the balance had shifted since the days when the mere mention of the bloodline's name could open city gates and scatter enemy armies. The investment that he laid to Samarkand in 1500 after Christ revealed both his determination to restore the inheritance he had received and his inability to command the resources necessary to achieve such ambitious goals. The city that had once served as the jewel of the house's domains, its workshops producing treasures that amazed visitors from across the known world, now closed its gates against the very bloodline that had made it great. The irony cut deeper than any reversal, that the capital of a realm built on the principle of nomadic superiority should successfully resist the efforts of nomadic forces to reclaim their inheritance demonstrated how completely the old certainties had been overturned. For 7 years, the young prince maintained his investment with the persistence of desperation, employing every stratagem his advisors could devise, while watching his resources dwindle and his followers lose faith in the possibility of success. The city's defenders, supported by Uzbek allies who had transformed former subjects into active enemies, proved capable of matching every move he made, while drawing upon reserves that seemed inexhaustible compared to his own limited means. In the end, it wasn't poor planning or cowardice that brought him down, but the sheer imbalance of resources beyond even his tactical mastery to correct. Muhammad Shaybani Khan's intervention with fresh forces that vastly outnumbered the besiegers transformed what had been a stalemate into a route that sent the would-be restorer of house greatness fleeing southward toward whatever refuge he could find among the mountain valleys that had sheltered his ancestors in their earliest days. The fall of Samarkand in 1507 after Christ marked more than the end of an investment. It represented the conclusion of the bloodline's claim to rule over the Central Asian heartland that had been the source of their original strength. The city that had witnessed the transformation of nomadic conquerors into patrons of civilization now celebrated new masters whose victory seemed to validate the superiority of established customs over the innovations that had supposedly led to weakness and reversal. Even in this moment of apparent triumph, the victors faced challenges that no amount of success could entirely resolve. The domains they had conquered contained populations whose prosperity had depended upon the networks and establishments that the previous regime had created. Destroying these would satisfy ideological preferences, but it would also eliminate sources of revenue that any practical government would need to maintain its command over such vast and diverse lands. For leaders rising on the ruins of old orders, the treasures housed in workshops and libraries posed a subtle threat, reminding them of the principles they were now bound to deny. Simply destroying texts and artworks would eliminate potential sources of future wealth, while antagonizing populations whose cooperation was necessary for effective rule. Yet preserving them might seem to validate the very synthesis that the victors had claimed to reject. The solution that emerged involved a careful dispersion of both human talent and material treasures that preserved their value while eliminating their potential to serve as rallying points for restoration movements. Master craftsmen found themselves relocated to distant centers where their skills could serve new patrons, while precious texts were distributed among various collections where they would be preserved but could not easily be reunited into the comprehensive libraries that had once made particular cities famous throughout the Islamic world. This systematic fragmentation of the inheritance that had been the house's greatest achievement ensured that future generations would know of its existence through scattered examples, while being unable to experience the full synthesis that had once made certain centers unique in the world. The Renaissance that had flowered under wise patronage withered not through deliberate destruction, but through the gradual dispersal that separated each element from the context that had given it meaning. Meanwhile, in the highlands of Afghanistan, the dispossessed young prince who had failed to reclaim his birthright began the painful process of adapting to circumstances that no amount of ancestral pride could change. The mountain fortresses that had once served as stepping stones to dominion now became refugees for dreams that could no longer be realized through conventional means. The choice he faced was stark: accept permanent exile from the centers of influence, or seek new domains where the house's name might still command respect. The solution he eventually chose would carry the bloodline's story into realms that their ancestors had touched only briefly, transforming reversal in Central Asia into opportunity in regions where different conditions might allow the fusion of custom and innovation to flourish once again. The death of one dream would become the birth of another, proving that even the most decisive reversals need not mark the end of a story whose conclusion had not yet been written. Looking back from the perspective of centuries, the fall of the last Central Asian domains marked not the end of the house's significance, but rather its evolution into something that could adapt to changing circumstances while preserving the essential elements that had made its greatest achievements possible. The apparent reversal that drove them from their ancestral lands would ultimately lead to triumphs that exceeded even the accomplishments of their legendary founder. demonstrating that true greatness lies not in the ability to maintain unchanging forms, but in the wisdom to preserve essential principles while adapting them to new possibilities. Dawn broke over the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush as the exiled commander gazed southward from his refuge in the mountain stronghold, his breath forming clouds in the thin air, while his mind wrestled with possibilities that seemed to shimmer like mirages in the distant heat of the plains below. Behind him lay the ashes of dreams that had consumed 7 years of his life in fruitless siege, the bitter taste of defeat that had driven him from the lands where his ancestors had once commanded the obedience of nations. Ahead stretched territories vast and wealthy, where the descendants of earlier conquerors had grown soft behind walls that had never faced the fury of one who carried the blood of the world shaker himself. The young lord who had failed to reclaim Samarkand possessed neither the vast hosts that had followed his great ancestor across 3 continents, nor the accumulated wealth that had funded expeditions reaching from the Mediterranean to the Ganges. What he did possess, burning within him like an ember that no wind of misfortune could extinguish, was the unshakable conviction that greatness lay not in the territories one inherited, but in those one had the courage to seize when fate offered its fleeting opportunities. In the bazaars of the mountain capital, where merchants from across the known world gathered to exchange goods and gossip, tales filtered northward of the chaos consuming the sultanates of Hindustan. The Lodi dynasty that had established its grip over much of the northern plains found itself beset by rebellions that erupted like wildfire across territories too vast for any single command to control effectively. Provincial governors declared independence with impunity, while ambitious nobles carved out personal fiefdoms from lands that had once acknowledged a unified overlordship. More tempting still were the reports of internecine warfare that had weakened the very foundations upon which the great metropolis's standing rested. Ibrahim Lodi, the current sultan, had alienated his own Afghan nobility through policies that favored certain tribes while marginalizing others, creating resentments that festered like unhealed wounds. His harsh treatment of subordinates who dared question his decisions had transformed potential allies into actual enemies, while his failure to maintain the delicate balance between different ethnic and religious communities had undermined the consensus that effective leadership required. These intelligence reports, gathered by merchants whose caravans carried more than mere goods across the mountain passes, painted a picture of opportunity that seemed crafted by Providence itself. Here was a realm whose wealth exceeded that of any Central Asian principality, yet whose defenses had been weakened by the same internal divisions that had once made Transoxiana vulnerable to domination by a determined invader. The very abundance that should have provided strength had instead bred complacency, while the sophistication that might have enabled effective resistance had become entangled in courtly intrigues that paralyzed decisive action. The commander understood, with wisdom purchased through bitter experience, that opportunity alone was insufficient to guarantee success. The forces at his disposal remained pitifully small compared to the hosts that would oppose any serious attempt at invasion, while his treasury contained barely enough gold to maintain his current followers, let alone recruit the additional warriors such an enterprise would require. The arithmetic of conquest seemed to argue against any attempt to transform aspiration into reality. It was at this crucial moment that fate provided the catalyst that would transform possibility into actuality. Daulat Khan Lodi, governor of Punjab, and one of the most influential nobles in Ibrahim's increasingly fractured realm, had reached the conclusion that his master's erratic policies threatened not merely his own position, but the stability of the entire region. Faced with demands from the capital that seemed designed to humiliate rather than govern, he made the fateful decision to seek external assistance in resolving what internal mechanisms had proven incapable of addressing. His emissaries, traveling by secret routes through the mountain passes that connected Punjab with Afghanistan, brought more than mere invitations. They carried detailed intelligence about the dispositions of enemy forces, the loyalties of various commanders, and the weaknesses in defensive arrangements that a skilled invader might exploit. More importantly, they offered something that no amount of personal ambition could have provided: legitimate justification for intervention in the form of a formal request for assistance from recognized leaders within the target realm. The lord who received these overtures possessed the vision to recognize their significance beyond their immediate tactical implications. This was not merely an opportunity to gain access to wealthy territories, but a chance to present any subsequent invasion as restoration rather than aggression, liberation rather than occupation. The narrative framework that such legitimacy provided would prove as valuable as any advantage in sustaining the loyalty of populations who might otherwise view foreign domination as an unwelcome imposition. Through the winter months of 1525 to 1526 after Christ, preparations proceeded with the methodical care that distinguished calculated risk from reckless gamble. The young commander understood that he would have only one opportunity to succeed. Failure would mean not merely the loss of his current refuge, but likely the end of any hope that his lineage might recover the greatness that had once made their name feared across half the world. The host that assembled in the shadow of Afghan mountains bore little resemblance to the massive forces that had followed the original world conqueror across the breadth of Asia, where previous expeditions had numbered their warriors in the tens of thousands. This force comprised barely 12,000 men, supplemented by a handful of cannons whose bronze barrels represented the most advanced technology available to his limited resources. Yet what these troops lacked in numbers, they compensated for through the quality of their training and the intensity of their motivation. Cavalry formed the heart of the army, their tactics sharpened by continuous warfare against foes skilled in turning inferior numbers to their advantage. These horsemen had learned to move with the fluid coordination of dancers, their individual skills blending into collective capabilities that could achieve effects far exceeding what their numbers might suggest. They understood that speed and surprise could accomplish what brute force alone might find impossible. Supporting the mounted warriors were infantry formations that had mastered the use of matchlock firearms, weapons whose tactical employment remained imperfectly spent months, perfecting techniques that combined archery with gunpowder weapons to create devastating volleys that could break cavalry charges while maintaining sufficient mobility to avoid becoming trapped in static defensive positions. Perhaps most importantly, the expedition's artillery component, though small, had been carefully selected for maximum psychological as well as physical impact. The cannons that accompanied the host could breach walls that had never faced such weapons, while their thunderous reports would announce to all who heard them that this invasion represented something qualitatively different from the tribal raids that had characterized previous conflicts in the region. The march that began in the spring of 1526 unfolded with the precision of a chess master executing a combination whose final outcome he had calculated moves in advance. Each day's advance brought the host closer to objectives that had been selected, not merely for their value, but for their symbolic significance in establishing the legitimacy of the enterprise. Local populations, who might have resisted foreign invaders, found themselves greeting forces that claimed to represent the restoration of proper order, rather than the imposition of alien control. When the two forces finally faced each other on the plain of Panipat, the contrast between their respective approaches to warfare became immediately apparent. Ibrahim Lodi, commanded troops that vastly outnumbered their opponents, his ranks swollen with war elephants whose massive bulk had traditionally guaranteed success against cavalry charges that formed the backbone of most Islamic forces. His confidence in numerical superiority had led him to adopt formations that relied upon weight of numbers to overwhelm whatever resistance the invaders might offer. The commander who faced him across that dusty plain understood that conventional wisdom would predict his defeat with mathematical certainty. Everything that experience suggested about the relationship between force ratios and battlefield outcomes argued against the possibility that 12,000 men could prevail against a host 3 times their size. Yet he possessed advantages that no purely quantitative analysis could capture, developments in methods and technology that could transform apparent weakness into actual strength. What followed wasn't just a confrontation between 2 sides. It became a clear sign of how fast warfare was evolving everywhere. Where combat had rewarded courage and individual skill above all other virtues, the emerging reality favored those who could coordinate complex operations involving multiple types of troops working in carefully orchestrated sequences. The deployment of artillery created killing zones that channeled enemy advances into predetermined areas where concentrated firepower could achieve maximum effect. The cavalry, rather than charging directly into superior numbers, employed hit-and-run methods that gradually wore down enemy cohesion, while avoiding decisive engagement until conditions favored a final assault. Most crucially, the integration of gunpowder weapons with established battlefield roles created possibilities that opponents had no experience encountering. When Ibrahim Lodi fell beneath the weight of attacks that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously, his death marked more than the end of a dynasty that had controlled northern India for decades. It represented the triumph of adaptation over established practice, of flexible approaches over rigid adherence to conventional methods, of quality over quantity in the eternal equation that determined the fate of forces and the destinies of nations. By seizing the great metropolis, the young ruler showed he had taken to heart the strategies his ancestor had once used to turn success into accepted power. Rather than simply occupying conquered territories as a foreign invader might, he presented himself as the rightful heir to leadership that previous kings had forfeited through their failures to maintain justice and order. The narrative of restoration, rather than occupation, enabled him to recruit local allies, while neutralizing potential opposition from populations who might otherwise have viewed his triumph as a national catastrophe. The true measure of his achievement lay not in the territories he had conquered, but in the fusion he began to create between the diverse elements that comprised his new realm. The practices that had evolved in Central Asia under his ancestors' leadership were adapted to Indian conditions without being abandoned entirely. The patronage that had made certain courts famous throughout the Islamic world was re-established in new centers where different artistic currents could interact and influence each other in unprecedented ways. Under royal patronage, new architectural works emerged that proved courtly design principles, shaped over generations, could be brought to life using local methods and resources. Gardens, whose geometric layouts reflected mathematical principles developed in Central Asian centers, were planted with flowers and trees that thrived in the humid climate of the Gangetic Plain. Palaces, whose proportions embodied classical Persian ideals, were constructed using building techniques that Indian craftsmen had perfected over centuries of practice. More profoundly still, the new dynasty began to develop approaches to leadership that balanced the demands of controlling diverse populations without sacrificing the coherence that effective management required. The challenge of maintaining control over territories that encompassed multiple languages, religions, and customs demanded developments in organization that went beyond anything previous kings had attempted. The solutions that emerged would influence the development of imperial systems throughout the Islamic world and beyond. The personal memoirs that the Lord began to compose during quiet moments between campaigns preserved not merely the chronicle of his achievements, but reflections on the nature of leadership that revealed depths of understanding that few conquerors had possessed. These writings, destined to become among the most influential works of their genre, combined practical observations about the mechanics of domination with philosophical meditations on the responsibilities that accompany absolute command. Through his own words, later generations would understand how thoroughly he had internalized the lessons of his family's rise and fall, their evolution from nomadic chieftains into patrons of civilization, their ultimate displacement from their Central Asian homeland, and their eventual resurrection in territories that had once seemed impossibly distant from their sphere of influence. His analysis of what made houses endure or perish reflected wisdom that had been purchased through direct experience of both triumph and disaster. With his life winding down, the question lingered: were his achievements simply his own, or did they mark the beginning of something more enduring? The blending of customs that he had begun to create would require careful nurturing by successors who shared his vision and possessed the skill to adapt his developments to changing circumstances. The ultimate test of his inheritance would lie not in what he had accomplished during his own lifetime, but in whether the structures he had established could survive the transition to leadership by those who had inherited rather than created their positions. Standing in the gardens that surrounded his new palaces, where fountains played among flowers that had been transplanted from distant mountains to bloom beneath alien stars, the Lord who had transformed exile into dominion could reflect upon the strange workings of providence that had led him so far from the land of his birth. The rose gardens of his mountain refuge that had sheltered his early dreams now seemed as distant as the stars that wheeled overhead, yet their memory continued to influence the aesthetic choices that shaped his new creation. In the measured verses of poets who sought his support and the precise calculations of architects who designed his monuments, something of the spirit that had once made Samarkand and Herat famous throughout the civilized world was being reborn in settings that previous generations could never have imagined. The blending of warrior customs and scholarly refinement that had characterized his ancestors' greatest achievements was finding new forms of expression adapted to different climates and cultures, while remaining true to essential principles that transcended geographic boundaries. The name that had once struck terror into the hearts of enemies from the Mediterranean to the Gobi Desert was being transformed into something different but no less significant, a symbol of achievement that could inspire wonder rather than fear, creation rather than destruction, the patient work of building rather than the dramatic gesture of domination. Whether this evolution represented the natural development of greatness or its essential corruption remained a question that only time could answer, as the wheel of fortune continued its eternal revolution beneath the unchanging stars.